Thank you. My name is William Makon Deng. I'm from South Sudan, and I'm like 27 years. When I was abducted, I was very, very small. I just know my name. I don't know the date and anything. But I know that the people I'm living with are not my family. The family can eat. If there is a remaining food, then you can eat. If there is no remaining food that day, you remain without food that day. That was how my life was. I was beaten by anyone, even a child like me can beat me, and I cannot raise my hand to defend myself. When you are still new, they don't give even space. They know that maybe you will escape them. This sometimes you sleep with your hand tied and then tied it against the pole and like that. And when going to take care of the animals, rear the animal in the bush, you go with the children, and they are all armed. They have guns. Some children who used to try to escape and fail to escape, they used to beat them, and even they used to kill some. Sometimes they can cut this bean so that you cannot run, you cannot walk. You can cut it, and then they put you on the camel or on donkey and then walk. That is how my life was when I was that was slavery. There is no help at all. No one help you. No one say why you always do this to this child. Is still a child and all this. This is maybe a first interview before I met with some people and they interviewed me, and I was not able to talk because the hard time I went through is really I couldn't able to speak, and many people I saw were killed. Some were set on the fire. It's really a very bad image. Myself, if I find someone and tell me that is treat like this and like that, I know that this person really need help, and if I have a power, I can help the person because I know how things are going really in the other part of the world, how people are treated.
That was incredibly moving. I think we would all agree. Welcome. I want to thank you all for being here in the lovely, dark, shadowy, warm room. Do we have lights just for right now? Great. Hi, I'm Ellen Aronson Prince. I am the Southern California Regional Director of the New Israel Fund. I want to welcome you all. Welcome you all here, and thank you so much for joining us this evening and for making it through the rain. It's really incredible that you're all here and that I get to introduce all of you to, honestly, two remarkable people. And I've had an opportunity. I actually know Maya Paley quite well, or well enough, I should say. The New Israel Fund has a very unique relationship with the organizations that are being sponsored here, that are bringing you this information. Maya Paley from, and excuse me if I keep looking down to make sure I have the name of every organization correctly, from Right Now, actually started as a New Israel Fund social justice fellow and spent a year in Israel, and this was the area that she connected to, and basically started working with the African asylum seekers, and this became her passion and her mission. With that, it's really Maya who's brought this evening together and was approached with HIAS, who I know that's not what this evening is about, but when you get the chance to go to their website to learn the story of this remarkable organization that has been around for 130 years, primarily and initially working with Jews from around the world who are refugees and finding them homes. Finding them a home in the United States, finding them a home in Australia, finding them a home in South America, finding them a home in Israel. And as time goes and passes, and thankfully, as we don't have as many Jewish refugees, unfortunately, there are still refugees in the world, and it is still our responsibility, and that's what it is, to be Jewish. You are responsible for the rest of the world. And that's what HIAS has done. And now they are really working with the African refugee community and trying to find homes for them. It's unfortunately an incredible story what these asylum seekers are going through in Israel right now. Just recently, about 6 months ago, there were riots within South Tel Aviv with the underprivileged community being upset with the asylum community that have come there, feeling like they're taking our jobs, they're infiltrators, when the truth is they can't work. I think that we'll learn so much more this evening, but before we get into you meeting with the speakers, we are going to show you one film clip just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. And the way the evening will work is we will have a presentation from both HIAS and from Right Now. I also just want to thank very much the National Council of Jewish Women for opening up this amazing, beautiful space. I don't know if you've been here within the last 5 years, but they really have just done an incredible, incredible push in trying to create a vibrant community out here, and it's just absolutely wonderful. ECAR, thank you so much for promoting the event. And what many of you, I think what you've seen, and probably the name that you all know about is Rabbi for Human Rights, which is based here in North America. There's also one in Israel. They've actually had a name change and a branding issue. I shouldn't say issue. I love the name. It's Tuhura, although someone could correct me because my Hebrew is so wrong. But as we were talking, the other day, of course, what you think of is Passover, and I hear the rabbi, and I just hear the shofar, and I think that it really is it's pretty amazing. I think it's a great name because you hold on to it. So why don't I close off and we'll just watch this film and then we'll open it up. Thank you.
Israel is a country of refugees, a country founded by refugees, and yet there was no real expertise or understanding in refugee law, especially because Jews who go to Israel are by definition not refugees. They're coming home, so to speak. There weren't that many countries engaged in the negotiation of the Refugee Convention in 1951, but Israel was one of them because one of the primary functions of the Refugee Convention was to deal with the problem of displaced persons in Europe. Israel signed the convention but never passed any legislation to actually implement it. So there were no laws in place. They relied on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to advise how to treat refugees and how to treat asylum seekers, but they never felt it necessary to actually pass any laws because their numbers were just so small. It just wasn't an issue for Israel until 2006.
So we have to pay for we have to contact first the smugglers, then we have to pay them money for them so as to take us to Libya across the Sahara Desert.
And then we moved from Sinai to Israel to cross the border on foot. And there was the Egyptian soldier on the border, and they killed people if they knew that you are crossing the border. They start to shoot you. And we came at night across the border, but it was very, very difficult. But finally, we succeed to come to Israel.
My name is Kidare Isa from Eritrea. I left Eritrea 5 years ago.
So like everybody, they gave us a bus ticket to Tel Aviv. and then we came here to the Kandabask Park. In the park, there are many refugees who doesn't have any work, who doesn't have any shelter, and they spend their night and their life in that park. Nobody talks about it. So this is the most difficult moment of our life in Israel.
זה מאוד מרגש, זה מאוד קשה. זה גדול על אנשים פרטיים, כל הדבר הזה. לא יודעת כמה זמן נצליח למשוך את ההתנדבות הזאת. בימים הקשים של החורף היה לנו מאוד קשה. אנשים ישנו פה מתחת לשקיות ניילון. באו רק עם חולצות מעילים, ניסינו לתת צמיחות, ניסינו לתת קצת ציוד. זה מאוד קשה. אנחנו מעט אנשים יחסית למדינה שיש לה יותר כוחות. נדמה לי שהמדינה לא כל כך מתגייסת לעניין הזה.
The asylum seekers who were coming in were referred to as infiltrators or as economic migrants, never as asylum seekers, certainly never as refugees. And this constant drumbeat of referring to them as infiltrators and that using that word over and over again can't help but prejudice society against them. These are Israeli society is naturally sympathetic to refugees because of Jewish culture, of Jewish values, and certainly because of the Jewish experience, particularly during the 20th century of repeated and mass displacement. Official from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported to duty. He told me, this is such a wonderful place. Well, Israel has its problems. At least there's not any xenophobia. And unfortunately, that is no longer really the case.
את יודעת מה ההבדל בין הכלב הזה לבינם? שהכלב הזה מתקלע. אתה צריך להתבייש.
The only way that you're going to be able to meet the challenge of asylum seekers coming into Israel, and it is a challenge, it is something that's going to be difficult to contend with, but which Israel has an obligation to contend with. But the only way to contend with it is to actually call it for what it is, which is an influx of asylum seekers. Whether they're all legitimate or not, you can't determine until you actually have a system in place to decide that, but you have to call the problem what it is. It's not an influx of infiltrators.
I'd like to introduce Mark Hetfield. Mark is the interim executive director of HIAS. He has quite an illustrious career with HIAS over the last 25 years on and off in 6 different positions. And really, I think, can give us the true scope of what's going on. And Maya Paley will discuss her experience. You're both going to go back and forth, and then what we'll do is open it up for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thanks so much for coming tonight to talk about an issue that we care a lot about. I need to first, I think, say a few words about HIAS so people understand why we're here and why HIAS is doing this work, because there is some confusion about that, or so I've heard. I delivered a Devar tour yesterday at Temple Emmanuel, and it was a perfect one for HIAS to talk about because it was about the Exodus through the Sea of Reeds, through the Red Sea, which obviously is relevant to what HIAS has been working on, or what HIAS did work on for the first 120 years of its existence, and B, it's certainly relevant to what these asylum seekers experienced escaping from Egypt into Israel over the Sinai. Basically, I like to say HIAS has had two phases of its life. There's an expression that you've probably heard: "May you live to 120, may you live to Moses' age." And HIAS, in fact, for its first 120 years, was very focused on the mass migration of Jews. We were started at the beginning of the mass migration of Jews escaping Tsarist Russia, escaping the pogroms between 1881 and 1920. There were 2 million Jews who left Russia, the vast majority of whom went to the United States, and the vast majority of those were in fact helped by HIAS. And we then ended that 120 years by helping another approximately 500,000 Jews out of the next 2 million mass migration that left the Soviet Union, left the former Russian Empire for the United States and for Israel from between 1970 and 2000. And so during that period, we were totally focused with assisting this mass migration of Jews. And I would call that our Exodus period. We're not in that anymore, thank God. We're now in what I call our Leviticus period, which is from that experience, from that migration experience that we've had, we learned. And when you look at Jewish law, there's 36 mentions of loving the stranger, treating the stranger like yourself, remembering that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, not wronging the stranger. This isn't just a value created out of ether. This is a value that's created from the Jewish experience. And like HIAS experiencing this for 120 years, when the mass migration period of recent Jewish history was over, we were able to move to the next stage, which is to fulfill a commandment, fulfill the Jewish value of helping others the way that we were helped or should have been helped. There'll always be Jewish migrants. HIAS will always be there to help them, but thank God it will not be, in the foreseeable future anyway, to the extent that it once was. And so this transition started to take place around 2000, around our 120th anniversary, coincidentally. And now we're in 12 different countries overseas. 98% of our beneficiaries overseas are not Jewish. 90% of the refugees we help in the United States are not Jewish anymore. But we still feel that our work is very Jewish because we're fulfilling Jewish values and Jewish commandments. Now, Israel fits into this as follows. We've helped with Aliyah to Israel in a number of ways over the years. But in 2000, when we knew this shift in our work was taking place, we looked at what was going on in Israel. We wanted to see, well, where can HIAS possibly add value? And it was obvious that Israel's a country of refugees, and yet we saw that there was no refugee law expertise in Israel whatsoever. There were no law courses that taught refugee law. There was just no understanding of it because it was never relevant because, like I said in the film, Jews who go to Israel, even if they were refugees before they got to Israel, were not refugees when they arrived in Israel. They were citizens when they arrived in Israel. So it just wasn't relevant, but I said it would be good for Israelis to understand it better, especially Israeli lawyers. So HIAS started the first refugee law course at Hebrew University, taught by our country director at the time, Neil Grungrass. And out of this course, a woman graduated named Anat Ben-Dor, who went on to start the Tel Aviv University Refugee Law Clinic. But again, initially, numbers were very small because it was focused on the couple of dozen asylum seekers that somehow managed to get into Israel. And so, in fact, in 2000, when the shift started, I asked to have a meeting with everybody in Israel who knew anything about asylum and refugee law. And the four of us had a very nice lunch. That's, as Maya can certainly attest, that is no longer the case. There are now many, many NGOs that have come out of nowhere to work on this issue. It's one of the really beautiful things about Israeli society. You don't see that. And again, you saw me reference what the UN High Commissioner for Refugees representative said. When he first arrived in Israel, he was so excited because he had come from serving in many other countries where this culture of creating organizations to help and to try to fill gaps that the government wasn't filling just doesn't exist in most countries. And he was really touched by that. He was touched by the lack of xenophobia at the time of his arrival. But unfortunately, that really has changed. How did it change? So our course really was an ivory tower kind of academic exercise from the time we started in 2001, but things changed at the end of 2005. On December 30th, 2005, there was a group of Sudanese, mostly South Sudanese, Christians from South Sudan. At that time, as you know, there was no peace yet reached in Sudan. And they were protesting their treatment in Egypt, and they were demanding resettlement. They were demanding from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office in Cairo a way to get out and to go to some country where they would be treated better. And during this protest, there were several thousand people peacefully protesting, but the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office was in a very nice neighborhood in Cairo. And then the people who lived there were getting more and more upset. The police didn't know what to do with the situation. On December 30th, 2005, they ended up opening water cannons on the protesters and beating many of them with batons and trampling them in the chaos that ensued. And the numbers are disputed to this day, but about 30 people were killed, 30 protesters were killed, many of them women and children in this. And after this horrible, horrible episode, the South Sudanese who were protesting said, we can't rely on the UN to get us out of this situation. We have to do something ourselves. And someone, I guess inspired by the book of Exodus, said, well, Israel's right next door. It took, may have taken them 40 years to get there, but I bet we can get there a lot faster. And so they paid Bedouin smugglers to bring them over in small groups. And when they got to Israel, if they managed to evade the Egyptian forces in the Sinai, which is the most difficult part of the journey, they would get into Israel over the Sinai, and they would just sit there and wait for the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, to pick them up. And the IDF would pick them up because Sudanese at that time were, by definition, enemy nationals. They had to be detained indefinitely. So they were brought to a prison basically and detained there indefinitely. And the Tel Aviv University Law Clinic, which again came out of the Hebrew University law course that we had founded, said this isn't right. You can't, because of somebody's nationality, especially if they're seeking asylum, you can't just detain them forever because of what their passport says, if they have a passport. So the court and the Israeli court system, again, it's another thing that we can really praise about Israel, said you're absolutely right. We can't detain everybody because of their nationality. They said the determination has to be made on a case-by-case basis about whether each of these asylum seekers actually poses a security threat to the state of Israel. They did these assessments, and not a single one was deemed to be a security threat. So one by one, they were released, and they were permitted to work. And of course, at that time, because this was after the Second Intifada, there was a shortage of unskilled laborers. So they found jobs without too much difficulty. They weren't exactly given work permits, but their work was tolerated by the government. Now, once word got back to Egypt about this, you can imagine how excited many South Sudanese were. And they started to follow, and the numbers got larger and larger and larger. And then Eritreans started to come over as well, and others from Sub-Saharan Africa. And fast forward to today, we now have 60,000 asylum seekers in Israel. The challenge, though, is that they didn't have a system to deal with this. They, as I said in the film, they had no means of actually deciding who is a refugee and who is not. Who do we have to keep here and who do we have to send back? And this is an important issue for Israel. Israel was one of the first signatories to the Refugee Convention. In 1951, they were active in the drafting of the convention. What does the Refugee Convention do? The cardinal rule in the Refugee Convention is that you cannot return someone to a country where they would be persecuted because of their race, religion, political opinion, membership in a particular social group, or nationality. And so there's an obligation to do an assessment case by case, and not to give them citizenship, not to allow them to stay forever, but you have to let them stay there. You can't return them to a place where they would face danger until they can go back safely. That's the rule. That's what Israel signed on to, and that's international law. So the United Nations was doing these decisions for Israel. Israel then started to take on that decision-making process itself. Because there was no expertise in this, they actually did ask HIAS, which has been doing this since the Refugee Convention was originally promulgated in 1951 for training. So HIAS went in there and we trained the Ministry of the Interior. We're still doing it to this day in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security from the United States. But the system was rather strange because they decided we're not going to hear claims from Eritreans, we're not going to hear claims from Sudanese, we're not going to hear claims from Congolese. We're just going to hear claims from every other country where asylum seekers are coming from. Why did they do that? Because they wanted to use the system to deny as many cases as possible, not to attract more people. In the meantime, Israel was, for the most part, I won't get into the exceptions over the years, but for the most part, they were respecting the Refugee Convention in practice because they weren't sending back the Sudanese or the Eritreans or the Congolese. They were allowing them to remain in Israel. So the basic pretext of the Refugee Convention was being respected. But the problem is, Eritreans and Sudanese knew that all they had to do was come to Israel, they wouldn't be sent back, and they wouldn't even have a refugee interview. And so as a result, you did have many of them coming, and they didn't have to worry about actually passing that interview. And this created a snowball effect. And now the vast majority of asylum seekers in Israel are from Sudan or from Eritrea, and with a few from the Congo. Because Israel didn't deal with the situation it had. And so we were involved in this. We have a lot of friends who came out of the refugee law clinic world who were not happy that HIAS was working so closely with the Ministry of the Interior because of these policies, but we felt it was our obligation to share our expertise and to try to make Israel be the best it can be in terms of developing a system, even though all these people were not part of the system and all these problems were being created. But then things really changed this year, or this past year in 2012, and this is also talked about in the film, where we felt we could no longer just be there as technical advisors, but that we actually had to speak out and be a little more proactive at a higher altitude. And that was after 6 years of the government referring to these people as infiltrators and as economic migrants, and never using the word asylum seeker. That had an effect on society. And you saw the effect there, where many in society, especially those that had the most among them, living among them, like in South Tel Aviv, started to buy into this rhetoric that these are infiltrators who come to this country to do harm. And in fact, if you read this statement that Prime Minister Netanyahu issued on September 5th of this past year, you can just hear the language that's being used about this group of asylum seekers and how prejudicial it is. He said, and this is an official statement from the Prime Minister's office, "It's important that everyone understands that Israel is no longer a destination for infiltrators. We are determined to stop the flood of infiltrators that has been here. We built this fence and it has already lowered the number of infiltrators by 90%. We will intensify steps against those who employ illegal infiltrators, and we will continue the effort to return infiltrators to their countries of origin." Now again, when you hear this word infiltrator over and over and over again, and you don't really know why these people are here, you're not going to have a favorable opinion of them. And this created its own problems. In June, there were literally riots in South Tel Aviv around the time of Shavuot. And the rhetoric at the grassroots level became very nasty and very widespread, not just in South Tel Aviv, but also in places like Eilat and even in Jerusalem. There were instances of black Jews, of Ethiopian Jews getting beaten up because they were mistaken for asylum seekers from sub-Saharan Africa. And the Ethiopian population in Israel has done everything they can to distance themselves from this whole issue because they don't want to be confused with it. So that's further fueled this xenophobia. And our big mistake at HIAS is that we just worked on being technicians on this issue, trying to work on developing a good system and ignoring this environment that was around us, this environment that was really fomenting hate and making it difficult to address the problem for what it is. We don't know if, how many of these asylum seekers actually have good refugee claims. We do know that in the United States, 85% of Eritreans are approved for refugee status because Eritrea is one of the most oppressive countries in Africa, if not the world. But again, an Eritrean can go to Israel and get the same treatment whether he has a refugee claim or not. That's a bad system, and that's something that needs to be fixed. But before Israel can do anything in terms of fixing this problem, it has to call it what it is, like I said in the film, which is an influx of asylum seekers, not infiltrators. And I'll say one last word. One of the worst disservices that was done was by a member of the Knesset, Miri Regev. And around the time of this mass violence, right after it broke out in June, what she said, and many of you may have heard this because it did get an awful lot of press, she likened African asylum seekers to cancer. She said that these are a cancer on our society. And then when she was criticized by everybody for making that statement, she apologized to cancer patients for the analogy. And the reason why she did a real disservice is because everybody condemned this statement, but it made use of the words infiltrator and the term economic migrant sound totally reasonable, by comparison. So she moved the ball so far that it became even more difficult for us to try to get them to call the problem what it is, asylum seekers. And if the government just starts calling them that, I think we will have made an awful lot of progress, and that'll be a move in the right direction. Thank you.
Let me just turn this off since I'm doing tech stuff as well. But for some reason, okay, not working. I work here at NCJW, so I'm kind of doing tech, staff, and speaking at the same time. It's very, my brain is going crazy. Thank you all for coming. My name's Maya Paley. Let me move this down a little bit. And thank you, Ellen, for introducing us, and thank you, Mark, for putting on this event that I think is extremely important. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more from the personal side. When I was in Israel from mid-2010 through the end of 2011. And I arrived, like Ellen said, as a New Israel Fund Social Justice Fellow. And that was right after graduating from Master's in International Affairs, where I focused on development, human rights, migration, and gender. And I got this fellowship, and I was like, I'm going to work in feminism. That's my thing. I do women's empowerment. That's what I've always done. And I got there, and it didn't quite work out. But I got this proposal from an organization called ASAF, and they are a humanitarian aid organization. I had never heard of them. I had never heard of Africans in Israel other than the Ethiopian Jews. I knew absolutely nothing about this issue, not a thing. And I got this proposal from ASAF, and they were looking for someone to conduct a 10-month-long qualitative in-depth research project. So I said, okay, you know what? I'll do that. That's what I'll do for my fellowship year. And I got sucked into it. I got sucked into it so deeply that basically I'm here today running this international coalition that is advocating for the rights of the asylum seekers on my free time. And that's just what happens when you are interviewing people on a daily basis and you're spending that much time with them, asking them questions about their entire lives, about what had happened to them in Eritrea or in Sudan, what happened to them in Sinai, why did they come, and what's happening to them now, and what is it like for them. And every single person you interview at the end of the interview says, so how are you going to help me? How can you help me? And you end up going to sleep at night and having nightmares about genocide, about rape, about torture, about prison, and about people asking you for help. And you just wake up every day and you're like, what, I can't do, what am I going to do? There are all these people asking me for help, and people are getting my phone number and calling me up on my cell phone and asking me to come this and do that. And I don't have any capacity to help anyone. I'm just a person. But the amazing thing is that there are now hundreds and hundreds of Israelis and Jewish Americans who are in Israel, and also, other diaspora Jews who are in Israel, helping and working with the African communities and saying, let's do something together. Let's figure out how we're going to fix this issue, because the government is way behind. And not only are they behind, but they're doing things that are really detrimental to the lives of the asylum seekers. And there's no support. So they are there, like you saw the volunteer, they are there every day giving out food. They're there every day when people come in and they've been shot at the border, taking them to the hospital. They are there every day taking women who have been raped to get gynecological services, finding shelter for those that they can find shelter for, handing out umbrellas when people are sleeping in the rain. That's what's happening. William, who you saw in the video, this is from a video that I made with Jillian Ezra, who's in the back. And it's actually a 25-minute long video, and you can watch it. It's online, Refuge Among Refugees. We made that because we want the world to know what's going on. This is an issue that hasn't been talked about very much. You know, look at how many of you are here. This is it, pretty much. You are the people who care. You are the people who want to know. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more at the end about what you can do to help, but we need you and they need you. William actually, as you saw, he was abducted as a child in South Sudan by northern Sudanese rebel groups. And he was treated as a slave, and he had managed to escape, and he made his way to Israel. And eventually he actually got into a university in Israel and started studying government. He ended up being deported. All of the South Sudanese pretty much have been deported now because the country became independent, and they decided that it was time to send them back. And you know, on the policy level, I can understand wanting to send people back because for Israel, it's you know, they don't want to have more the whole demographic issue, which we'll talk about. But the way that it was conducted was problematic. People were deported all throughout last summer. Some of them never received their belongings. Some of them waited 2 months to receive their belongings. All of the NGOs compiled mosquito nets and got together medicines to send to them, and a lot of them never received those medications. A lot of people have been back and are starving now, are really struggling to make ends meet. And there have been several deaths, at least 11 that I've heard of South Sudanese who have returned. William ended up getting deported, even though they petitioned and petitioned and petitioned for him to be able to finish his education in Israel. He ended up getting, and this is showing you kind of like how ridiculous some of the situation is within the government. The foreign ministry gave him a visa and said, okay, you know what, we've heard your petition. We're going to let you come back and finish your studies. He literally lands in Israel, and they send him back right away because the Ministry of Interior was like, oh, you know, we don't know why they gave you this visa. No, you can't come back. So after being sent back for the first time on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, for those of you who don't know what that is, being sent back for the first time on that day, he manages to petition and petition for himself to come back and study at IDC, and then he gets deported the day he gets there. And now he has no opportunity to go back because once you've been deported, you can't go back. So that's the situation that William is facing now. I want to tell you a little bit more about what's problematic about the policy. Mark talked about the fact that Eritreans and Sudanese are allowed to be in Israel and they're not deported, and that's really important. And I really do appreciate that is what's happening in Israel. However, what's happening on the ground, what's happening to people day by day as a result of that is very problematic. What you have is everyone when they get there, they get these visas that are called conditional release visas. And on the visa, it says, you're allowed to be here. We won't deport you. However, the second that it's safe to send you back to your country, we will send you back. And on top of that, it says on the visa in very large print, this is not a permit to work. So what happens is people the asylum seekers are getting hired by these agents who are often mafia people, and they are exploiting them. They are making them work 18 to 20 hours a day. Sometimes they don't pay them at all. Sometimes they only pay them part of their wage. And this is what's happening on the ground. This was one of the main things that people were talking to me about and calling me about and saying, oh, my employer didn't give me money, or I just got picked up for a day job and they never paid me after making me work for the entire day. And and they're doing physical labor. They're doing the cleaning. They're doing the construction. They're doing all the jobs that nobody wants. So that's a really hard thing to deal with. Now, what happened was in November 2010, I think it was like 9 NGOs or something, took this issue to the High Court. And the High Court said, you have to let people work. You can't punish them for, you have to let them work. They have to be able to sustain themselves. But what's happening in reality is that employers are afraid because they did not take that one line off of the visa. And so it shows you that it doesn't, it's great when the High Court makes these decisions and they really do make, well-founded and thought out decisions that are in line with human rights a lot of the time. However, what's happening in reality? What's happening with the police? What's happening with employers not wanting to employ people? And what's happening with people being exploited? So that's the main thing. So what we're asking for is refugee status determination, a procedure that what HIAS has been training the Israeli government to actually to conduct, which is that you assess each asylum seeker's claim as an individual. You listen to each individual story. And right now what's happening is they can get away with calling them economic migrants or calling them infiltrators because nobody knows. And if you ask the asylum seekers themselves, they'll say, you know what? We're perfectly happy to show you that like some of us are economic migrants and some of us are asylum seeker refugees, but you don't even give us that opportunity. Because if you're from Sudan or from Eritrea, you get collective protection, you get this conditional release visa, and that's it. You don't get your individual claim assessed. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. And if people end up not being, all of them being refugees, fine. But let's find out. Let's give people that opportunity to apply for asylum. Another thing is, according to international law, if you cross a border and you call yourself an asylum seeker and you say, I'm applying for asylum, by international law, you cannot be detained indefinitely. And in this situation, where people are not allowed to have their individual claim assessed, they're being detained indefinitely. They're being criminalized. There is an amendment to the anti-infiltration law of Israel was passed last June. And what this amendment said was that if you are an infiltrator, you can be detained in our prison for 3 years or more. So now what you have is people coming in, right away being detained, no due process, no proper RSD, refugee status determination, and you can just be detained indefinitely. And they've modeled these detention centers off of other detention facilities, like in Australia, for example. And I had to take a break from my research because Asaf asked me to do research on this issue for a month when I was there. And we ended up petitioning the government about it, about how this model is actually really detrimental to the health of the people who are in them. You have everyone with PTSD. You have children who are suicidal. You have people committing suicide in the detention facilities. And this is not going to be an open facility that you can just walk in and out of whenever you want. They're not going to have the right to work. I've heard arguments of people who have said, oh, well, they'll have shelter, so it's all good. They'll have shelter, and they'll have health care, and they'll have food. And it's not about, comparing. Sometimes it's not about comparing, oh, it's not as bad as this, or it's not as bad as that. It's about what is right. It's not right to detain people indefinitely. It's not right to treat people as criminals when they're not criminals. Another issue that's happening is you have, like what Mark was speaking about with the rhetoric, which is that the government calls these people infiltrators, which sounds like a criminal, and then you actually have people in the government and police officials who are publicly saying that they are criminals, calling them rapists, calling them thieves, saying that they're trying to beat their people up. You even have police officials who have said that the crime rate is 40%. But when you look at the published police statistics, the crime rate of the asylum seeker population is 2.24%. And that is lower than the crime rate of the Israeli public. So it's a big problem. The rhetoric is a big problem. The perception of the population is a big problem because people believe what they hear from the media, and the media believes what it hears from the government. So when you have a government, and when you have government officials who are publicly out there putting on protests, organizing protests, calling people a cancer in society, saying, you know, this place is for the white man, not for the black man, which is something that the Minister of Interior, Eli Yishai, said publicly. What do you expect the public society, how do you expect them to react? They believe it, right? When you have the government officials saying they're raping our women, most people believe it. Most people are not going to go in to, you know, the statistics online of the police department and find out the reality. So it's very difficult. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this because I'm talking about too many things. I'm just going to leave you with a personal story. So for me, on a personal level, it was not easy. Like I was saying in the beginning, it was very hard to do this work. And I came at this as a Jewish American. I also have Israeli citizenship. And I wanted to reconnect with Israel because I had taken a break. I was an Israel advocate in college at UC Berkeley, and I got very disillusioned by the end of it. And I was like, I said, okay, I'm going to do this fellowship, and I'm going to see if I can reconnect in my own way. And I got there, and I was working on this issue, and I befriended a lot of the asylum seekers. And there were two things. One is that the racism and the sexism interconnected. And I would be walking, there was a time that I walked through the bus station, the central bus station, not the central bus station, the northern bus station in Tel Aviv. And I was walking through the parking lot, and I'm just walking with two African men. And we were going to try and find them a job. We were walking around, literally knocking on restaurant doors, trying to find them a job. And this guy starts yelling at me in Hebrew, I know why you like them. I know why you like these black men. And I yelled back at him, of course, because I'm a feminist. And I was like, yeah, I do like them. Do you have a problem? And, and the Eritrean guys with me didn't know what I was talking about. They don't speak Hebrew. And I'm like, oh, don't worry about it. And they're like, Maya, there's no point. Why are you even fighting about it? There's no point. They don't care about us. They don't care who we are. And it's not worth it. And there was another time, and this is the last story, when I was at an Eritrean friend's apartment, and his neighbor, who's actually a Russian immigrant, started banging on the door hysterically and saying that he was going to kill me. And I knew it was me because in Hebrew, you speak, the language is gendered. So he was speaking to a woman, and I was the only woman around. And he was banging and banging and banging on the door, saying he's going to kill me because why am I spending time with Africans? I'm an Israeli woman. I should just be hanging out only with Jews. And this is something that was a wake-up call to me. We couldn't call the police because what are they going to do? Probably they're not going to really do anything. Most of the time they wait an hour to even come when the Sudanese or the Eritreans or the African asylum seekers call them. It was a wake-up call because I grew up here. I grew up in a Jewish American environment that was all about tikkun olam, that was all about what can you do to help others. That's what I grew up with. That was Judaism for me, and it still is. Those are the values that I learned. It really means a lot to me that you all are here because I really think that this is an issue that needs to be out there. We all need to care about this. The situation, the policy that Israel has is harming Israel. It's harming the asylum seekers, and it's harming us. It's not something that we want to allow to continue, and it's up to us to change that. There was one change that happened that I want you all to know about, in which 500 of the Darfuris got a temporary residence visa, so a higher level visa. They received health care, they were allowed to work, they were allowed to start businesses, and they were allowed to get scholarships for school and get an education. Most of those people have left Israel. What does that tell you? Most of them don't want to be there. They want to go somewhere else, probably here or Australia or Europe. They're not really wanting to be in this tiny country. They want to go where their other family members are. But how did those people get those visas? A big reason why is because of LA Jews like yourselves. LA Jews very privately lobbied the Israeli consulate here, who lobbied Ehud Olmert's wife back then, who lobbied Olmert, who ended up issuing these visas. That's a real difference. That is real change that you can see. It's tangible change. And my dream, my goal with starting this coalition right now is that we will come together and we will stand up and say, this is wrong. And as a community, we care about this issue and we want this to change. And there's a quote by Rabbi Hillel that always struck me, and it's actually in the back of the reports that you can check out that I published, that are, he says, when there's no person there to make a difference, strive to be that person. Thank you.
Why don't I open it up for a few questions? If you raise your hand and introduce yourself, please. Stand up and introduce yourself. And then say your question.
I wondered about your characterization, either of you, of the absence of refugee law as a consequence of the law of return. Because it seems to me it's also complexly intertwined with the issue, with the Palestinian issue, and the problem of having refugee law is not going to be made except for in the context of that impending thing. So is it your sense, first of all, I wonder what's happening with the elections in relationship to this whole issue. And secondly, is it your sense that the best strategy is to try to separate the issues of asylum from refugees? Are those separable categories? Is it a good thing to separate them? Is it a dangerous thing to separate them?
Yeah, that is an excellent question and a very complicated one, but I'll try not to go on for too long about it. The international community in 1951, when they drafted the Refugee Convention, did refugees a big service, but Palestinians and Israel, frankly, even a big disservice. And that is Palestinians are explicitly excluded from the Refugee Convention because they are covered by prior instruments that created UNRWA. And as you know, the difference between UNRWA's work and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees' work is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is dedicated to finding solutions for refugees. That is not part of UNRWA's mission. And this, of course, was by design by all the parties to keep the problem festering. Oh, UNRWA is the United Nations Refugee. What is it? United.
It's the United Nations entity that solely works with the Palestinians.
Yes. United Nations Refugee Works Agency or something like that, and it's the agency that runs the schools in the territories, runs the so-called camps in the territories, and and provides services also in Syria and Jordan for Palestinian refugees. And in fact, you may have seen this famous video that Danny Ayalon did, which talks about how this happened and how this exclusion occurred, and how unlike refugees in the 1951 convention sense of the word, Palestinians passed down their refugee nests from generation to generation to generation. So the issue is confused. They're not part of, if Israel were to have a refugee convention, it wouldn't impact the Palestinian issue at all if they were to have refugee laws because of that distinction. But nonetheless, you're right, in the eyes of the public, refugee has a very specific meaning in relation to the Palestinians, and I think that is yet one more impediment that prevents refugee laws from being enacted.
All the more reason why we need to figure out a solution to the conflict. About 60,000. Are you talking Palestinian? Yeah. About 60,000 African asylum seekers in Israel now.
And I'm sorry, there's a question in the back. And then 1, 2, and then 3. And if you can stand up so we can hear you, please, and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Paley, and I'm here with Marlene. We actually work for the UN Refugee Agency, so thank you so much for this. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the role of UNHCR and how UNHCR is actually getting involved or helping or bringing in the international context of international protection.
Yeah, now that's also a very long story. But when I said that I had that lunch in Israel with all the refugee experts, two of them were working for UNHCR at the time, and one was a former Israeli diplomat, Mickey Bavli, who was the honorary head. And at that time, he wasn't even paid anything. He didn't have a salary. He was basically a volunteer, and he had one employee working for him, and so they had a very limited role, as I said, making refugee status determinations for the few refugees that were in Israel, for the few asylum seekers that were in Israel. And HIAS was in a strange position. Usually the UN High Commissioner for Refugees funds non-governmental organizations like HIAS, but in Israel, HIAS and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee were actually funding the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office there because it was so underfunded. The budget was $25,000 a year that was given to them by Geneva, so you can imagine you couldn't do very much with that. But eventually there was what some would call a handoff, others would call a takeover between the UNHCR and the Israeli government, where the Israeli government took on the function of making those asylum determinations. But before that happened, the UNHCR got much, much larger and much, much more active. They moved their office from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. They had a very large office with lots of international staff making refugee status determinations or recommendations to the government anyway for refugee status. And then once the government took over that from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR started doing in Israel what it does in other places, which is giving money to civil society. Many of the organizations that are being funded by the New Israel Fund are also now funded by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to try to fill the gaps, because there are services that those refugees need that are not being provided by the government. For example, healthcare. While Israel has a state-of-the-art healthcare system and socialized medicine, the only asylum seekers who are eligible to access it are the Darfuris that Maya was referring to, and that's 500 out of 60,000. The other 59,500 can only access emergency room services. Anything else, they need to go to the Physicians for Human Rights medical clinic or similar small providers that are funded in part by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as by other non-governmental funders and foundations, but not by the Israeli government. Likewise, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees funds representation for asylum seekers, because the only way they can get through the system is with legal representation, because you really do need that access to the courts after the refugee status determination. So they're doing many, many things like that. They're funding ASAF, which Maya mentioned, which provides very badly needed social services and psychosocial services to asylum seekers in Israel, but again, on a very small scale. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is playing a very, very important role by supporting these organizations. And one thing that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is probably considering doing right now is starting doing asylum determinations again, because unfortunately the Israeli asylum system is not yet working. And if Israel actually does start deporting people the way they've been threatening to, they've only been removing people to South Sudan, which, as Maya said, is a policy issue. It's a little different because South Sudan is a new country where it's more difficult for people to prove that they have a refugee claim. But if they start deporting people to places like Eritrea or the rest of Sudan, Sudan proper, that could cause some serious problems if they don't have a good functioning refugee status determination system. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, as it does in some other countries with dysfunctional asylum systems, may have to start making recommendations in a parallel system to that which is run by the government, which would be very unfortunate, but that's something that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees may have to do. And one last thing I will say is that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Guterres, has been very good in terms of personally intervening with the Israeli government, trying to get them to stop using the xenophobic language and terminology that I was referring to. I know that UN High Commissioner for Refugees Guterres wrote to Prime Minister Netanyahu beseeching him in the summer to improve the public rhetoric about this situation so that the fires of xenophobia would stop being stoked. And I don't know that the Prime Minister ever responded to that letter.
There are two questions. You'll be the third question. Okay, well, hold on. You'll be the third one. One over here. The woman with beret was second, and then you. I'm just going to interrupt with one thing as I have the microphone, which is just to let you know that for whoever doesn't know, Israel works in a different way. When it comes to bringing issues to court, like for us to get to the Supreme Court, it's basically a series of a number of courts that you have to get to. Go through that system. In Israel, it's a little different. Non-profit organizations, or I should say NGO organizations, specifically those that are actually in the family of the New Israel Fund, are able to go directly to the high court in Israel, representing people. So there were a series of 6 organizations that represented 6 Sudanese in October. What they did was able to put a stop of imprisonment of Sudanese asylum seekers until the government basically was deciding what they were going to do, until a decision was made. But it's important to understand how organizations, how NGOs are able to use the system in trying to stop certain things that are happening.
And just one more note about what both of you just said. What this does to the people, and obviously they're not here to speak to you, so I'm doing my best to speak to you on their behalf in a way, because I was interviewing them, and I still am in touch with a lot of people. But the fact that UNHCR has no power anymore is a really, it confuses the asylum seekers, because what they understand is that UNHCR is supposed to help them, and they don't have the capacity to help them. They don't have the power to. So to them, it's like, we don't understand. Why is UNHCR not helping us? Why aren't they interviewing us? And what we say is, look, they're funding the organizations. To them, that's not enough. And similarly, with the policy, you take these issues to the high court, and the high court makes a decision. And most of the time, like I said, it's a good decision. But these policies are changing all the time. You have the Minister of Interior suddenly one day saying, okay, in 2 weeks, we're going to detain 15,000 Sudanese. And then we went crazy. Everybody was freaking out and saying, oh my God, we have to figure out a way to not be detained. And then the government, the Prime Minister eventually, and the administration eventually said, oh, wait a minute, no, that's not true. He doesn't have any authority to do that. Weeks later, though, after everybody was up in arms and worried that they were going to be picked up on the street and put in prison. So the confusion causes people to have really, it's very psychologically difficult for them to deal with this on a daily basis, to have new policies or rhetoric about new policies happening all the time, and you never know what's really going to happen to you.
This is really fascinating and so important, and I can think of like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different questions. But one of the things I wanted to ask about was, you made a big point about how there isn't this tradition of how to deal with refugees in Israel. And I understand that a large percentage of these people are actually refugees and asylum seekers. But I also think that that sort of approach, I'm sure there are some who are, economic refugees and not political refugees. And on some level, if someone's coming from Eritrea, escaping slavery, they would be, an asylum seeker. If someone's escaping starvation, the way we're approaching this issue, they would actually be, on some level, infiltrators, invaders. And I think that, not only maybe there isn't a history of how to deal with refugees or non-Jewish refugees, but there isn't much of a, or maybe, I don't know that much about it, but it seems to me there isn't so much of an understanding how do you deal with immigrants who are not Jewish to Israeli society and the state of Israel. Because on some level, that's also, I think, a huge issue, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Okay. First thing, just so you're all aware, Eritreans have the highest acceptance rate as refugees in the U.S., 85%. And in general, Sudanese and Eritreans get accepted as refugees in other Western domestic countries all over the world 75 to 85% of the time. So we're talking about most of this population is probably refugees, and less than 1% of them are receiving refugee status in Israel. In 2011, there were 4,600 asylum claims made, whatever that means, and only it was like 1% or something. It was less than 1% of that. Was 1%? Yeah, 1% who received refugee status, whatever that means. So I understand your question about how to deal with economic refugees or economic migrants. I think that it's important for us to focus on this issue first, to say, you know what? Right now we have 60,000 people in the country. There are no people coming in anymore because they've built the barrier at the border with Sinai. How are we going to deal with the 60,000 people who are already in the country? To me, that's the most important thing, because those people need to be treated humanely, with compassion, and they need to have their human rights guaranteed. And part of that is assessing their claims. Once we do that, we can figure out what to do with economic migrants. Maybe it's saying, okay, we allow a certain amount of people to apply for something like a green card or something, or temporary residence, or we help them resettle elsewhere where they will be treated humanely and fairly. But when you look at the situation right now, it's very hard to even consider that, because if any of these people are sent back to Sudan or to Eritrea, their lives are in very, very serious danger. So it's very hard to say that, to really, I can't really worry about economic migrants right now when that's the situation.
My name is Esther Magner. I was wondering if there was any of these difficulties with the Ethiopian immigrants when they came. Are there any sort of similarities, or it's just a completely different story because they came as Jews?
A completely different story, to be honest, because they didn't come in as refugees. There is an issue with the Ethiopian community. There is an issue now with the Ethiopian community as the second, or you should say third wave that Ethiopians have come in that are questionably Jewish, to tell you the truth. And so it's a very different situation. Where it's not a different situation is, unfortunately, the Ethiopian community does have less resources coming into the community. There is racism not within the community, I should say, within Israel towards the community. So there are issues, and there are, as discussed, there are issues, unfortunately, also in the lower income community, presuming that anyone that is of color is actually is an asylum seeker or an infiltrator, or a cancer, whichever word you want to use in terms of whoever is the person that's there. There are issues of racism within the schools that the Ethiopian kids have been told, okay, you're not welcome in the school. They've changed school bus schedules so that the Ethiopian kids are going in a bus by themselves. There are issues, but they're completely different issues.
With regard to asylum seekers?
I can give you a response on that, actually. So, as you all know, Sinai is in Egypt, and there is a huge human trafficking issue happening there with the Bedouin criminal organizations who started out smuggling people, ended up turning this into a large-scale business, and now what they do is they torture people and make them call their families back in Eritrea and collect tens of thousands of dollars. It's now up to $45,000. And they torture them while they're on the phone until they get the money, and then they'll let them go. And there is rape happening. Most of the women who are coming through, most of the Eritrean women are being raped on the way. So the situation in Egypt is really, really bad. And there have been lots of petitions to the Egyptian government, and there has been I'm sure that a lot of government officials in different places have asked the government of Egypt to do something, but they're not, and they don't want to go into Sinai, and they don't want to really deal with the issue. What they do allow is they have UNHCR there grants these people refugee status. They don't have a lot of resources, so they're not really getting that much out of it, but they get refugee status.
And the lovely gentleman with the hat, I apologize. Yes, you have 2 questions. I am going to ask for you to make the questions clear and concise.
You know, if you use a microphone, I might be able to hear you. Otherwise, I don't hear a word you're saying.
I'm just asking you to make the questions clear and concise.
I think we all sympathize and empathize with these people, and we have to say they're courageous to make this trip, and knowing that they're going to have difficulties and so forth. It's certainly a humane issue. My first question is, what is the UN doing about it? And the second question, I recognize that Israel has an economic problem, issues, jobs, and so forth. What is being done? How about these people being trained and serving in the Israeli Defense Forces?
Yeah, and this also relates to the question that was just asked about Egypt as well. I mean, part of the problem does definitely stem in Egypt, which is where there was a push factor. And the problem is that Egypt is so strategically important to the United States and to other countries that there just has been a reluctance to really prioritize this issue and to really hold Egypt to account, to treat asylum seekers better. And this is true within the UN and also by the United States. I believe that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the United Nations is doing everything they can to help with this issue based on my work, but the problem is that the UN is only as strong as the governments behind it. And while the United States has been engaged on this on a very aggressively, but on a very low level, it's not something that Secretary Clinton exactly raises on a regular basis with Netanyahu. It's something that the Deputy Chief of Mission will raise often with his colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it just doesn't have the same impact. So there needs to be a higher level of attention in Israel and in Egypt, because the real root of the problem is in Egypt, but Israel has obligations because people are going there. In terms of serving in the Israeli Defense Forces, that's certainly something that they would probably welcome the opportunity to do, because that entails all sorts of privileges and education that Israelis get when they serve in the Israeli army. But they're a far cry from that. Even Israeli Arabs are not required. Even the ultra-Orthodox are currently not required to serve in the Israeli army, and the asylum seekers wouldn't even be permitted.
They're not citizens of the state of Israel. Are there any other questions? I could take 2 more. Well, why don't we do 3 more, but why don't we do this? Let's hear all 3 questions at the same time. We'll take them down and then we'll just answer them. So if I could have your question.
My question is very simple. I was wondering if you could tell us more about non-profit organizations, non-governmental organizations already work in Israel on this issue. How does work that they do actually look, and how does right now, how would you like to fit into what's already being done on ground, and how do you see our roles? If you can tell us more about, steps that need to be done.
Okay.
Bruce Franklin. I understand that what we're looking for, if I understand correctly, that you're suggesting that we need to have some sort of establishment of a refugee classification by the Israeli government. Could you just illuminate a little bit what you think, should we have that? What would be the process by saying, how do they not become permanent citizens? Is that a possibility? Is that not a concern? Is that part of the reason they don't want to proceed with this, based on your experience?
Great. And there was a question. Yes, thank you.
I'm trying to connect 3 dots in my head, right? One of them is that, unlike most communities, this community doesn't really need to be in Israel specifically. They have no tie to it, right? So they just want their Maslow's pyramid filled, basic human rights. Secondly, that there are other countries that are happy to take them, and there's quotas for that. The third data point is that one of the things that Israel is actually really good at is training people very quickly to do things, like learn languages in a matter of weeks, and et cetera. So outside of the political realm, is there an economic solution that connects these 3 dots, that maybe sets up a temporary, trainee status, business trainee status, and maybe fuel cells or growing oranges, or so I think there's a fantastic opportunity that's being passed up in this Israel.
Okay, so what I got was, on the first part, basically what are the other NGOs that are out there? How does Right Now fit in? And what are the action points that everyone can take? Why don't we end with that one? Because I think that's a great way of ending. Bruce, what's the process right now? How are you basically not going to have them be permanent citizens because this is an issue of Israel as a Jewish state? Also, Israel as a democratic state. How do you balance the two? And the last question, is there actually an economic consideration that we should say? Why don't we start with the economic consideration in terms of well, actually, let's start with Bruce's, with basically the whole process and how are we dealing with the refugee and permanent status?
That's a good question, and there's some confusion in this country when we talk about the issue, because in the United States and in Canada and in Australia and in other countries that are immigration countries in a different way than Israel is, of course, an immigration country. If you come as an asylee, if you come as a refugee, that inevitably, almost inevitably, leads to citizenship. The assumption is you'll become a citizen of the United States, your children will be citizens, and you're here permanently. That does not, however, have to be the case under the Refugee Convention, nor in Israel necessarily should it be the case. We're certainly not advocating for that. We're just advocating that people get legal residence with the rights to work and other social rights until it's safe for them to go home. And in fact, refugees can't always go home, but oftentimes they can. And the case of South Sudan is one in point. Although that was not a perfect return by any means, and there were lots and lots and lots and lots of problems with the way that it was done, ultimately, people could go back to South Sudan at some point sooner rather than later. And that could also apply to Eritrea, where we don't think this dictator who's there now is going to be in power forever. We know that Eritreans do, in fact, want to go back to Eritrea. But of course, there is the point that the longer you stay in a country like the Salvadorans who've fled the war in El Salvador, the longer conflicts drag on, the more Israeli people will be, and for those who stay there for a long time, it will be difficult for them to return. So there's no question it's a complicated issue, but there's no obligation for Israel, nor are we advocating that Israel give them any type of permanent residence. And in the case of Israel, I think it will work. But the thing is, they have to have a functioning system. What we learned in this country is the worst enemy of a functioning asylum system and the best magnet for abuse is a backlog. And what Israel has created for itself is a backlog of basically 60,000 people whose cases are not getting heard. The United States had this problem in the early 1990s when we had a very dysfunctional asylum system where the backlog was literally, if you did the math, it was 170 years long for your case to be heard. They realized that that was a problem because everybody was applying for asylum, because if you applied for asylum in the U.S., you would get work authorization. So tons of Mexicans and Brazilians and other people with no asylum claim were coming to the U.S. and applying for asylum because they knew they would get work status and they knew their case wouldn't be heard for 170 years. And that's exactly what's going on in Israel now. I don't know that the Eritreans would have an 85% approval rate in Israel because, again, it doesn't matter if you have a strong claim or a weak claim. You're going to get the same treatment that you get no matter what. So Israel has just got to have a system for deciding who is a refugee and who is not. The other thing they're doing, we're in a very different stage now than we were before. There was a time when there were thousands coming over the border every month. Last month, I heard there were 7 people who actually came over the Sinai. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that Israel is just not a very welcoming environment right now for these asylum seekers, as you've seen. The other is that they have basically completed the construction of a fence along the Sinai. And this is, I would argue that the creation of a fence is not a violation of international law. It's fine for Israel to do that. They have the right to do that. I would even say that they should do that. But it does create certain complications that need to be taken into account. And I'm speaking of this because I was previously stationed in Haiti for the Immigration Service in the mid-1990s. And there, yes, there was a lot of political persecution and a lot of poverty that people were fleeing from. Some were fleeing the persecution, some were fleeing from poverty. But to do that, they would get on these boats that were extremely unseaworthy, and many more people would die trying to make the flight out of Haiti on these horrible boats than would die from political persecution within Haiti. It's a similar situation here where people are dying in the desert trying to get across the Sinai, whether they're killed by the Bedouin, whether they're shot in the back by Egyptians. This is happening all the time, and Israel should do everything they can to deter this type of behavior. But the bottom line is, if somebody makes it to Israel, they have the right to apply for asylum, period. And now people are making it to the fence, but the fence is actually on Israeli territory. It's not in Egypt, it's in Israel. So if you make it to the other side of the fence, you're in Israel. And Israel will still have the obligation to hear your asylum claim and decide whether to send you back or not. And that's where they haven't been behaving themselves so well in the last couple of months, because those who have made it to the fence, Israel has taken in a few women and children, but has been pushing back the men into Egypt, which is not kosher.
I don't know if you want to lead into economic reasons for, or was your question sort of answered?
Oh, I can respond to a couple of your questions. Yeah. So, well, one thing you said was that other countries will take them. Not true. Other countries are dealing themselves with an influx of refugees. This is a global issue, and I think it's going to be one of the more important issues in the next several decades. Europe receives plenty of refugees, plenty of asylum seekers on their own soil, Australia as well. Plenty of, this is not, there's no country that's going to want to come in and say, oh, we'll help you out, Israel. We'll take 60,000 refugees off your back, especially if Israel's not even putting them through RSD, refugee status determination, and labeling them as refugees. They're not going to just want to help Israel out like that for no reason. It is something that people are talking about, that the government and that the NGOs and all of the stakeholders are talking about. Maybe there's a possibility of burden sharing in the future. But I think before that even happens, no other country is really going to be open to that until Israel makes this change.
And I'd like to say too that your point about training people before they go back is a good one. And in fact, Israel was doing that for a period of time. They did it with individuals from the Ivory Coast, and then they did it with the South Sudanese. And HIAS was involved in this. It was our job to make sure that the people were voluntarily going back, that they were not being forced to go back. And the Israeli government, through Mashav and other Israeli organizations, was actually giving them training so that when they went back to South Sudan, they would have a skill that they could use, which they really needed, because South Sudan is importing a lot of workers to do jobs because they don't have skilled workers at all. So Israel was doing that at one point. But then when Israel said to the South Sudanese, okay, you can either go back voluntarily this month or we deport you next month, then HIAS withdrew from the program because it was no longer a voluntary return program, and that's your choice. And those training programs also ceased.
Just to put something in perspective, and I feel like I'm sounding very negative, I love Israel. I wouldn't work for an organization that supports the state of Israel. I think what's important to know that Israel, now I don't know how it changed within the last year and a half, but was ranked the 4th highest in the Western world of having the largest gap between the rich and the poor. Understand they were right behind the United States. So you do have to put it in perspective, and I think we live in an amazing country. We don't always see the poor. In Israel, it's a much smaller country. Part of the issue is that most of these things are happening outside of the periphery, being outside of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The difference with the asylum seekers is they're in South Tel Aviv. So that's where a lot of the tension is happening. About other organizations, I mean, you have the Association for Civil Rights. You have the ARDC, the Asylum, I'm going to look at, I know acronyms and I don't always know, the African Refugee Development Center, Cod Lavod, ASAF, the Aid Organization for Refugee and Asylum Seekers in Israel, the Clinic for Migrant Rights and the Academic Center of Law and Business. These are all NGOs that are on the ground, that are actually going and petitioning the high courts. There are organizations then that are outside, and that's where Right Now would come in, and I'll let you explain a little bit more about that.
So if you ever do want to go to Israel and work with the asylum seekers, just email me and I'll connect you with any of these organizations, because I'm in touch with them all the time. And they're petitioning the courts, but they're also providing humanitarian support on a day-to-day basis, psychosocial support, counseling, healthcare, filling all the gaps, even education, scholarships, emergency funding, filling all of the gaps. And you can also read all about them on the NIF website. Okay, right now, what are we doing and what can you do? We're doing a lot. We have our first petition, which was about the 3 policies we want changed. We want refugee status determination. We don't want deportation without someone's case being assessed, and we don't want people to be detained indefinitely. One thing you can do is you can sign that petition and you can also share it with everyone you know. We also have a petition on the same topic, but for rabbis and cantors and other spiritual leaders to sign. That's co-hosted with Rabbis Human Rights, now TRUA. You can get rabbis to sign that, get cantors to sign that. The more Jewish spiritual leaders that are invested in this, the more we're able to say, this is a community issue that we all care about. We have a new petition out that is to stop the detention of victims of trafficking and torture. And that just came out last week. And you can sign it once, we have sheets for you to sign it right outside the door when you leave. Another thing we're doing is we're now partnering with the Eritrean community or a movement called Eritrean Youth for Solidarity and Change. And we are actually junior partners in their advocacy to end trafficking in Sinai. And they created this petition to go to all the entities that could possibly urge Egypt to change. And so if you can help spread the word about that, and we actually have an event to launch that campaign on February 10th here. The coalition is just a group of volunteers. Every single person is doing this on their own time. You can be a member by just joining the listserv and just receiving our emails and responding with whatever your opinion is, or you can be a member by becoming our graphic designer like Robin over here, or you can become our videographer like Jillian in the back. And these are just people in LA who are giving their time tremendously to this cause. We have people in New York, Minnesota, New Jersey, Chicago, Boston, DC, San Francisco, Australia, UK, Argentina. And we're working as much as we can to respond by writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds, creating video clips, putting information out there, speaking, creating events, whatever you want to do that you think can help, we'll do. It's up to you. So if you're interested in getting involved, contact me or sign up outside the door, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
And I can add, I was just given a long laundry list of our own things you can do as well. And one thing, which Maya already mentioned, which is important, is that when you meet with, or you have missions that go to Israel and meet with Israeli officials, it's important to raise this issue so they know that we care. Maya was absolutely right, that the reason why Prime Minister Olmert moved on the Darfur issue some years ago was really because of pressure from the diaspora, particularly the United States, where we said, we're doing so much work trying to fight for Darfuris, and they're not really being treated very well in Israel. You've got to do something about this. And he and his wife certainly did in regularizing their status. Other things that can be done, HIAS, there's one NGO that's a new upstart that wasn't mentioned that HIAS is supporting, which is called Refugee Schoolhouse in Israel. That can be supported on the HIAS website, and that's an organization that gives language lessons for refugees in Hebrew and in English, so that they can function better in Israeli society. We also would encourage you to sign up for the HIAS listserv. We have a listserv called the Mideast Refugee Digest, which really focuses on this particular issue. But most importantly, really, it's really important for you to educate your own community and to bring this issue up at every opportunity with those who are interacting with Israelis. And one final note, I had the privilege of going to Geneva at an event sponsored by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in December, which was a dialogue focused on faith and refugee protection, not limited to Israel by any means, but looking at it from a global perspective worldwide, where it brought faith leaders from all major faiths together to talk about refugee issues. And on our delegation was Joseph Telushkin, who many of you may know is a leading Jewish author and ethicist and Orthodox rabbi, as well as Rabbi Nava Hefetz from Israel, who is a Reform rabbi and is the Director of Education for Rabbis for Human Rights. But Rabbi Nava came up with the idea, which the High Commissioner himself embraced, which is that there should be a clergy code of conduct, not just for rabbis, but for clergy of all faiths, where clergy sign a statement and agree not to sit passively by when they see xenophobia breaking out in their own community. That clergy really, of all faiths, because this is a part of all faiths welcoming the stranger, really have an obligation to stand up and to get their community not to tolerate xenophobia and mistreatment of refugees and migrants. And we're very excited about this. We're going to be working hard on this, and hopefully it will be launched on World Refugee Day on June 20th. We're going to encourage as many rabbis as possible from the Jewish perspective, and our colleagues from other faiths will encourage their clergy to do it, but we want them to sign on to this and to really become more aware and sensitized to the issue. For us, it's a very positive way to engage in this issue, particularly in Israel, because we don't want to be seen as being critical of Israel, unduly critical of Israel, but we do want them to be a light unto the nations on this issue, and we're really trying to help them do that.
One last thing is that I just, with right now, I just want you all to realize how difficult this has been a long process to get all of these organizations to sponsor an event like this. We have New Israel Fund as an advisor, TRUA as an advisor, working with HIAS, but to get other Jewish organizations involved has taken a lot of time. So I really want to encourage all of you to speak with Jewish institutions that you work with and that you're involved with and that you know, and to say to them, look, you need to start talking about this issue. You need to start having events about this issue, and you need to get on board with this. That's all. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming. I think that there's one thing, I just wanted a little anecdotal thing. What's interesting is that you'll hear that there are different ways that organizations in Israel are working with the community. And what I thought was most interesting as you're talking about language, there was a huge problem when the bombs went off in Tel Aviv. You had the asylum seekers that had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what the sirens were. They didn't know where to go. And people on the ground, we had to have advocates come out on the ground to tell them, hey, this is where your local shelter is. That's a bomb that's coming. It's a new world for them. I mean, as it would be for all of us, but we don't have the same language barrier. So it's hard, but try to put yourself in their perspective. It's really a very, very different place to be. Thank you all for coming out on sharing your Sunday evening with us. Thank you to the National Council of Jewish Women.